on YouTube, because some people don't want to join via Zoom. So they
Yeah,
can
that's fine.
watch on YouTube, and they can post questions on our Slack channel, and then
Okay.
I'll relay them. There we are. Okay, so we have launched a poll to ask our audience some questions if they've heard of event modeling, or they've heard of event sourcing.
I answered.
CQRS.
The answers are skewed.
Well, I didn't leave the option for invented there, so because I said yes, no, and used. So basically, if somebody's used it, they will be able to give us that differentiation. Because I was once in an interview with somebody. They asked him, "Do you know this?" And he said yes. And they said, "Do you know that?" And I think it was like Kickscobal, and do they know RPG? Yes. And do they? It was some weird IBM database, and they said yes. And do they know Burroughs Poll Select? And they said yes. And then it turns out that the person had heard of all these things, but they didn't actually know anything useful about them. So this is quite an audience. We've been, when we had in-person meetups in the distant past, I don't know, when was that, Rory? 2019?
Yeah. I think some might have squeezed in 2020 still.
We had anywhere between 30 and 100 people. And we had one meetup where we had one person.
We did do it in a riot. Yeah,
yes, it was literally, there was a riot in Johannesburg and everybody just went home.
Yeah.
And this guy happened to live walking distance from the venue. He was totally unaware of the riot. He walked over because there was going to be free pizza.
Oh my gosh.
And we had Skulk Cronje. He's also known as Ace Beer, contributor to ASCII Doctor, and he's done a lot of Gradle plugins and contributions. He lives in Andorra, and he was visiting family here, so I invited him to come and speak to us about the top tool chain and stuff like that. And so he was there with a bunch of JNB Conf t-shirts, and this guy left with a JetBrains license, an armful of t-shirts, and 2 boxes of pizza. And it was 3 organizers and Skulk and 1 attendee. So that was our worst one. And in terms of online, we rarely had as much as we have now, but I see quite a few people from abroad. So you obviously have a following that hang on to every word that comes out. So we're all waiting for the book. So when is the book?
Yeah, I'm working on it still. I'm actually glad that it took this time, because in the last, especially during COVID, there's been a ton of lessons learned, especially with the way you do this in a virtualized way, and just the big advantage of having a digitized version, and it gave rise to at least 2 major products that are built for this, besides these canvases that are just Miro and other things.
Yes,
so yeah, I'm actually glad that there was no book. I'd be stuck writing 2 instead of 1. The subsequent one after. But yeah, the book is divided into 3 sections. First being the theory, the kind of the underpinnings of the thought behind it, which we'll go over in a short presentation I'm going to share with you. The middle section is all about the mechanics, which are fairly simple, etc. And then the third section is the practice, which is really how you deconstruct common business patterns into the simpler patterns, and is really the large part. It's kind of I really enjoyed Michael Feather's book on refactoring legacy code, or working effectively with legacy code. It was one of the best books, I think, to learn how to do test-driven development properly and do unit tests properly. And the format of his book was exactly the same style, where he had, in order to learn what he was teaching, you just needed to read about the first third of the book. And the last 2/3 of the book was a catalog of all of the different situations you find yourself in with legacy code, where you have a God class, or you have some other anti-patterns that you want to get out of, or different coupling situations. But it all stemmed from having a safety net of having unit tests underneath your work.
Yes.
And he went to the extreme of defining legacy code as code that doesn't have unit tests in that book, right? So he's a big proponent of that book, and I think it was highly usable. And you didn't find many used copies, which says a good thing, because people kept them to just have as a reference, and they would either pass it on to a colleague or just have it in the library or on their desk actually using it. So I don't want to just go and publish something when I have what's enough for a book. I actually want the book to be something that is as timeless as possible, that can have the best reference material along with the better refined kind of theory and the mechanics behind it. For example, we've had, looking at the original article on event modeling on eventmodeling.org, the translation pattern is something that worked really well in person with sticky notes on walls. But given digitization, it's actually easy to have the full proper pattern that follows that strict adherence to command event, read model, and then back to the UI. And it always goes to that pattern. So while digital notations can still kind of shrink or find a shorter way to say that, there's very little advantage when it's digital to do that. There's a lot more opportunity to name how a series of events is viewed, and not just react to those events individually as commands on the other side. You can actually do temporal aspects, such as this must bump up a few events before it actually issues a command, like with the hotel example, where we don't emit events until someone leaves the example I'm talking about is in the main article. It's the hotel example. And there's this idea of an automatic checkout where you have GPS events coming out of someone's phone, and the minute they leave the property on their last day of the stay, it triggers an event that says that they left the hotel, and you can basically have an automatic checkout done. So if you look at the typical kind of UML-ish way to design this, it would be the fact that this event can just trigger this command to go and post your bill to your email. Well, that's kind of half the truth. The real part that's missing there is that there is a projection of those events called location status, whether you're in or out of the hotel. And so having that read model there really does express a lot of the thinking behind it. And I think what event modeling did is it really finally dug into a lot of the hidden things in the traditional ways of modeling systems. So it was quite
no, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, let me start formalizing the meetup.
Yes, let's officially start before we give out too much information.
We have a fair number of attendees online. We are 14 minutes in, which means that we've given them 2 times 7 minutes to be ready. Quite a few have answered the poll, so which means that yes, I'd say somewhere between a third and a quarter has never heard of this before today, which means that you have a relatively virgin audience.
That's good.
So, welcome to the Josie Jug. Josie is our local nickname for Johannesburg, and which is one of the coldest places on the planet at the moment, except for maybe Antarctica. We are literally freezing.
7 records.
Yes. Minimum. So there was lowest minimums and lowest maximums in various places in the country. People posting pictures of. So there's an area called Vereniging, which is near the Vaal River, which is one of our biggest rivers. And this guy had a bench on the edge where he would usually have a nice lunch on a sunny day. And it was all frozen because there's a willow tree next to it, hanging onto it, and the willow and everything frozen up. It looks like this weird organic igloo. So yes, we are freezing. For those of you joining us from other parts of the world, a very cold welcome, and thank you for joining us. I've invited Adam to. I'm gonna try his surname.
Good luck.
When I first read about event modeling, I was as excited as I was when I first encountered object-oriented programming and read Grady Butcher's book, because I realized there's something that speaks to my view of the world and how things can fit together. And so I'm really excited about this, learning more, and I can't wait for an opportunity to start using this. And I imagine some of you are here because you are further along this journey. Some are just starting. But I predict that in a few years, we're going to look back on this night and say, yes, this is where it started for me. Or you're going to look back if you weren't here and say, why didn't I do this earlier? So without saying much more, I'm going to hand over to Adam. We haven't even tested if he can share his screen. Zoom crashed just before the meeting.
Just a participant. I think I should be able to share. I have the button, so I can share it.
Yes. So over to you. And if you want people to chime in with questions, I think they can ask. If I think they're pertinent, I will interrupt you. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure there's going to be plenty of opportunity to ask questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to try and keep the presentation short and then go into a more question answer mode where we can kind of go over an existing Miro board where we have a lot of the concepts already sketched out. So any places that people want to dive into, we can very quickly show and demonstrate and explain. So maybe keep your questions reserved for until the short presentation is done, and just note them down or just ask them in chat, but expect them to be answered after. We can go through them and then we can continue with more advanced questions once we start to look at some of the other material I'm going to go through.
So first question was, please record. Carl, yes, we are recording, and we will, it's on the live stream on YouTube, so it'll remain there. And what I usually do is I cut out some of my chatter up front, and then we put the shortened version up as well. So over to you, Adam.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone in South Africa, for welcoming me. I'm sorry to hear you're having a cold spell. We just got out of our record heat, broke records day after day for highest temperature ever, north of the 50-degree latitude line. Yeah, nearly 50 degrees Celsius for Canada is unheard of. And we're just sitting in a bunch of forest fires here, unfortunately, due to that. So from one end of the world to the next. I hope the delay doesn't really matter since we're mostly streaming here. I think Zoom's doing a good job and YouTube's going to do a fine job streaming this. So I'm going to start to let's get through the presentation here so that we can have more questions and get some interaction with people that are attending. So let me just see if I can get this to work. Press F5 on the presentation and then share my screen. Oh, it's disabled. So the button's there, but you need to add me as a co-host or allow me to share the screen. So I'll wait for that and see if I can share the screen when there it is, it works. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna try and see if this works. So can everyone see my screen now? I hope so. Okay. Thumbs up, excellent. So, okay, my name is Adam Dimitric, for those that are wondering how to pronounce my name. It's really a best guess, it's not a real name. I think my father's aunt, after World War II in Poland, everything was destroyed. So for the records office, she changed some letters. So it used to be a Ukrainian name. It's no longer. I think the Y got changed from an I. So there's very few of us in the world with this spelling. So, you know, because it's not a real name, your best guess as to how to pronounce it is good enough. And yeah, that's it. So event modeling is quote unquote developed by me. I never set out to do this, and we had a nice chat earlier about, you know, this history about how it came about, and it was really about doing more with less when you had really aggressive timelines or budgets and needed to keep quality up. So I founded a company that basically allows us to only do things this way, and event sourcing, etc. So a lot of the insights started when I finally saw the light in 2008, when I finally learned about event sourcing, because I was in enterprise development for a long time. And what really appealed to me about event sourcing is the accounting-like diligence to data that systems were working on, and realized how little it matters how things were developed as long as they met their SLAs, etc. That we could follow certain things like open close principle more easily. We could have a really good handle on having the least amount of bad coupling in systems and just keep the good coupling that we need. So there's a lot of this history that we have with event sourcing, but slowly event modeling showed that it can be used for traditional regular systems by showing what people are trying to do, and the events actually are things that people remember. This entire idea that we have special things in software kind of went away because we had information systems for quite a long time. So we'll get into some of those questions and where the ideas came from as we go through this. But event modeling wasn't set out to be made. It kind of ended up needing a name when we saw that there was nothing else that was doing this. There was a whole bunch of other practices that together you had maybe 50 tools or 20 tools that would give you the complete picture. We were able to find a method that addressed what all other methodologies and tools kind of did in one place. It's kind of like a giant blueprint for your house. Instead of having multiple pages of different documents of how to build the house, this blueprint idea works in engineering, and it really works well in software too. So this is also a way of saying that we're making software less of a art and more of a engineering discipline, where we're really talking about an accounting-like way of being diligent with how systems work. So let's get into it. So one of the first insights that I had is that there was a lot of, with the current tooling that we're using in software development, it wasn't as natural to human beings. And that's why people say, programming is hard and this looks alien to me or whatnot. Whereas everyone that sees a house being built, they understand what a hammer and a nail is, and and they can put two and two together to see that, yeah, if I practice this, I could cut the wood pieces to the appropriate sizes and hammer them in, and I could see how I could also make a house. Right? In software, we don't have that. One of the reasons is how the human mind works is quite different how we were going to be working with software over the last 4 or 5 decades, but things are changing for the better. These are and we have to realize that this is a very young industry, and so there's a lot of clumsiness and learning that's going on. Now we're coming out the other side, understanding that technology is just the new pen and paper, and we still have the same business processes. So there's some interesting things about the human mind that we don't take advantage of enough. Some practices do, like behavior-driven development and specification by example. They start to look at, okay, human beings, they want to see an example of how to do things. So if I show a scenario that is actually using example data, that'll be easy for me then to write a system that makes that happen. With a stream of events, that's even more natural. Of course, there's the arguments that you can't, fully specify a system. Well, the counter argument to that is that people that are providing the specifications, they themselves don't have that full grasp yet. They push that onto engineers to create and work off of specifications that have no room left for interpretation. So what we do is we try to embrace that we are humans and we know that we can fill in the blanks quite well. Or I use an example all the time of how our minds are really, very slow processors, yet we can process a tremendous, be quite adept at going through this world, not having, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second refresh rate on our retinas. We have a whole bunch of neurons that is just a mush of chemicals that don't react very fast, yet we still have this projection of what reality is around us to function quite well. So it's this ability of correctly filling in the blanks to missing pieces of information. For example, your peripheral vision is black and white. It's not color, well, probably not black and white, but it's not sensitive to color as your focal point is. Yet, when you look at the room around you, you see colors all around, and that's actually your brain coloring in the rest of the picture, if you can imagine. The same thing happens with how we track motion. A lot of interesting things happen in the mind. The other one is memory, where we have an ability to recall a story that we heard a long time ago. Once you have kids, if you have a family or you have nephews, you can recite a story that you heard many years ago just because you remember the key frames in the story, the key points, and you're able to fill in everything else in between to make the story full to the child. And believe it or not, when they grow up, they'll be able to recall that too. That's an incredible ability of the human brain that we don't trust enough. Now, the argument comes to that, well, one human can fill in those blanks one way, another can do it a different way. That's okay. If that's a big enough difference, we'll drive another example through that and get something stable between the two versions. And this is where collaboration comes in. So humans also work well in teamwork. And this goes back to really addressing why as a species we're successful and how civilization started, because we were able to pass information on and we're able to collaborate. Those two things are just an incredible piece of the human mind that we don't really take advantage of enough in this field. So the fact that I can use a story instead of a complex specification to get something across actually makes that stick. Yes, a UML diagram might be more accurate, but it's not going to be recalled. It also is going to take a lot more effort. So there's a lot of these trade-offs, and we've seen in actual practice, the trade-offs are quite good on the side where we trust the human brain to do a lot of the work for us. So back into history, most information systems are ledger-based. They are books of account for many different things. I think this is, I forget, I think this might be something from the Hudson Bay Trading Company, but we can look at how prices were kept and who got what. All of these things, how we organize society is really pen and paper of an additive only type of ledger. this linear way of going through time and looking at what happened in events is at the heart of stories. Stories are part of the Bible, so you can go back and see how religion shaped humanity, and but all the way to the beginning, even before the spoken word, where people around a campfire in a tribe were drawing things in the sand with a stick. And the spoken word, and then the written word, and then the printing press, etc. These are all left to right linearization of information. Yet we really push in this industry to have graphs, and graphs they don't convey the same ability to remember as linear event, one thing after another. So that's what we have to get back to. The other thing is that we get distracted is that state is everything. One of the things about CQRS and event sourcing, for those people that don't know what that is, I can explain that a little bit more later. But Fred Brooks had a really big insight that he didn't really care about those flow charts. He was one of the first few to realize that the specification of information systems and programs was alien to the human mind, and what wasn't was how we treated the data underneath. And if you could show the data then and how it changed, then you would have a better understanding of the system. Now fast forward to today, when we don't have a lot of the limitations of tape drives and other storage limitations, Fred Brooks would be in a much more capable environment to continue with this line of thinking. And I think it would be interesting to see if he was in his 90s, he's retired. I got a nice message from him back about all of this a while back. It would be kind of neat to see if he was born later. Well, maybe he wouldn't have these insights at the time, who knows, but it would be kind of neat to see what his work would have been if we didn't have these limitations to storage. But basically, to me, what that meant is I can express any system as these set of state changes, which is what CQRS and event sourcing focuses on. Event sourcing is really about storing state by just what has happened, a ledger that continually grows. You don't edit it, you always go and interpret it. And CQRS is really about having a separation between who writes the source of truth and then who makes projections off that source of truth, or how we make the projections off that source of truth on another side of the system. It's really about dividing a system into two sides. One that takes care of the writes, meaning it looks at what is the source of truth, what is that ledger, and then we publish those as they happen to the other side, which that other side is made of multiple models that each take those events as they happen, either ignore them or react to them and change something to show maybe what your cart has as you're going online shopping. Every time you add or remove an item, that's a separate event, but the cart projection will listen to those particular events and update the count of some items or whatever you have. So when you display the web page, it just looks at that model and displays that information. It doesn't actually have to look at the events themselves. So in this way, everything actually is like CQRS and event sourcing, except that in modern systems, we just ignore the events. We throw them in the trash. We mangle the different views into the state of those events into one giant monolithic kind of canonical model. We call it the relational model. And that's where you have some of the bad coupling, where you have to reuse the table for multiple different purposes. But essentially, we are doing that. We're just doing it badly. And so this is a way to kind of show the limitations of working this way. But then, and that's fine. Maybe you keep the system as a traditional system, but at least you have an accounting of where the coupling is, so you can make plans for changes. But ideally, and in my view, it'd be really good to start to capture the actual individual events and move to that way of just simply recording what happened and have that accounting style mentality when you're automating your systems. So this is all that event modeling is. This is a very famous now drawing, which shows that you can pretty much show any non-trivial system with about 4 separate patterns. And it's really 2 patterns, one for input, one for output, kind of similar to the source of truth versus the projections off the source of truth. The second 2 patterns, you have external state input, external state output. Those are a buildup of the first 2. And in fact, when you're specifying them fully, you always break those out into the first 2. But for the convenience of quickly noting something down, when you're collaboratively designing systems, you may use these shorthand specifications for the external state input and external state output. So essentially what I've done is I said any system, if you do systems thinking, you can you can say that you have state changes and state views within the system, but then you also have ways to interact with external systems. So you can have another set of patterns for that. And so this will follow quite closely to systems thinking, really understanding the boundary of what you own and what you don't own, and understanding all those all those places where lines cross into your system to identify the inputs and outputs as they're going. We do this through swim lanes to represent multiple different systems. So here we have inventory, authentication, payment, and GPS. And there's a timeline that goes through it. And so this reads by example. You won't see any arrows going in the right to left direction. Everything keeps moving to the right. It's kind of like your Git history. Everything just points into one direction. It's an example of what happened, and that's one of those things that I talked about. What's more capable by the human brain to take in. And so we always use a by example. This is a little bit of a shorter legend type of diagram, so I don't have actual properties on those different elements that you see. And you can see in the lower hand legend, there is the command, which is the intent to change something. For example, you press a button to add something to your shopping cart or to register the website. You're changing the system, right? It now has your information in it. You registered for that website, or you added something to your cart. And then the green, which is the output. So output is when we need to inform the user. So it's the ability to empower the user to use the system and change the system. And then there's the opposite. There's the inform the user. It's a more passive activity. You click on a different web page, etc. That's not an actual changing of the system. So we don't mark that with a blue sticky note. We say that we just get to this other page and we see that we have a cleaning schedule, for example. And currently the cleaning schedule is such and such, and that's built up on all these previous events that have happened in the system. But at this point, we're looking at what the cleaning schedule is, and that is a projection of all the things that has happened before. So it's fairly simple. I use the middle layer for the blue and green to kind of be the boundary of where the inputs and outputs are, and they're in chronological order, so you can see with context as to when things happen. It's not just a API specification where you're kind of wondering when and how it's being used. You can see exactly where and how it's being used. It's more like a movie storyboard where you have the keyframes at the top and then you have your plot at the bottom to make sure that the whole movie makes sense. And so we look at it a little bit from that perspective as well as to how to do that. Of course, there's questions, well, software is more complicated than this. There's some if conditions, etc. Well, there's a bunch of categories of where we can deviate. We can just have different data, which gets transformed differently. And in that case, we can expand somewhere below in some given when then type of specifications and not interrupt the workflow, but show how the data changes with different inputs. However, the workflow stays the same. We may have small workflow changes, such as a good example would be where someone fails to log in because they mistyped their password. Well, you can show that they got the wrong password, and you can show an example of the screen that they would see. And then you can just immediately after that show them logging in correctly. You've captured both scenarios in one linear story now. Then there's really major changes to the workflow where it might be some sort of a large trade by a trading company where you're in the middle of acquiring $1 million worth of different stocks and you're halfway done and something goes really wrong. The market has turned and you're now overpaying for every subsequent trade. You're going to have a new workflow to back out of that acquisition or to stop it and leave it half done. It's a very business focused question as to how they're going to deal with that. But you generally say that if there's, you put a red line in the event model and put an arrow over to the far right and start to draw out what would happen if this other scenario happened. So you always try to keep things as linear as possible to keep that friendliness to the human mind, that I can read things through left and right. I can audit them like a set of accounting books. I can put a vertical line at any point here and say that I know what happened at this point, and I can talk about why that happened and how it impacts the next thing. I can join where the data is coming from. So another big advantage of this is information completeness, which is the ability to say that I didn't think up some property that magically appeared and is available to my screen. I have to go and look and see whether that actually is available in the system. And if it is, where it came from and who was in charge of putting that in. I can see who worked on that. The other thing that's really interesting about this is because of what we do here is we actually do enough design, not to the level of UML, which would take forever. We've done these as quickly as one afternoon for really core parts of a system, of a non-trivial system, where we can build from this an actual implementation that will scale, will do all the proper architectural paradigms to continue to be built on and not have to be rewritten. So we've done these in as little as an afternoon and came back with working software, in a couple of days with the UI, everything finished, to show the core concepts and basically prove that we have this done. So it's actually the fastest way to develop software, in my opinion. Ruby on Rails and all these other frameworks, they allow you to go fast, but what they're doing is really they're cementing your feet very fast because you're committing to a canonical data model very quickly, and actually at the wrong part of the software project timeline. You're solidifying some concepts there in a very hard to reverse way, and a lot of times at the very beginning where you have the least amount of information or practice with it. So I prefer this way. And then once you have some boilerplate code from project up in project, it becomes incredibly quickly to just say, well, I don't need anything like Ruby on Rails. I actually have some really good patterns. I have three or four of these patterns, really 2 core patterns. Most things are just command handlers and read models. And when I have a pattern for those, all I'm doing is changing the events in that code, but I'm doing very little infrastructure coding when I'm working through these. I'm really working through the actual state transitions of how the system will continue to work as I get on in the project, and I'm not really ever distracted by not things that are non-functional requirements. So I'm always focused on allowing me to build features, and because I have them designed, I have no difference when that feature will be done. In traditional projects that are done in a work in progress, agile limited kind of way, you build up cyclomatic complexity because you didn't know what was going to happen in the next 5 sprints ahead. You end up doing a lot of refactoring. That's called rework, and that's why the features later on have a much harder time to get implemented, and so you have this rising cost curve for features. And no matter how complex the feature is, they're really it shouldn't be the case, but it is when you think about implementing one feature at the beginning of the project. That same feature, if implemented 2 months down the road, is going to take a lot more effort, simply because of the amount of refactoring that's always involved in doing things without a design. So one of the core concepts is that this makes it easy to have a design for your system, and that design is not onerous to do. It incorporates things that designers do. As you can see, the top swim lanes are what the UI is at each point with example data. That's where you replace Figma or integrate Figma into this. So people are working on this together. Your architects are looking at the swim lanes down below. They're looking at the SLAs. You can superimpose some or mark this up with this happens within 1 second or whatever the SLA is. So you can start to design some of the architectural concepts. And in fact, it's done in a transparent way with everyone else understanding what's going on. So you don't have to be an ivory tower architect to say that you're going to have 4 services here. You can actually show everyone that, yeah, in fact, we have 4 services, but you don't even have to use those words. It's about, we have 4 places where information is stored, and these places concentrate on inventory, authentication, payment, and location data. So those are a way for people to demystify their sort of cliquey language from each discipline and role, and talk in just regular plain English or whatever your language is to get those concepts across. And that's really powerful. That being able to be inclusive really starts to disarm harmful people, for example, that hoard information and things like that. You're working in an open way where everything is quite transparent and collaborative. So it's been a very big advantage. Here's how some of those details are specified for how one particular view might change with different data. So we've done this to disambiguate some really large systems. I'll give you some examples of that. This is one of the first really large systems that we did using event modeling. So event modeling scales incredibly well to very large projects. We're currently dealing with an insurance company that has probably, let me see, well over 500, I think, events and read model types. Some of the tools like Miro just can't handle that large set. So we have probably 4 or 5 of these boards. And that's where the tooling is being built by other companies to basically be optimized for event modeling, so that you can show an unlimited amount of in size of an event model for a blueprint. But this is a very, remember I told you about those little red lines where a different process comes into play. This is blurry on purpose because it's proprietary information about that trading system. But this was a good example of where traditional, what we have as accepted practices was not good enough to get the project across. And I got called in across the country to fly to the East Coast of North America to, for one company, fix what was a failed project essentially for a couple of years because of the amount of restarts that they had. They did everything right. They had all the agile processes, and they were lightweight. They weren't owners. They weren't doing anything crazy like safe. They're doing all the right things. Yet the project kept getting reset because they were hitting big issues. And this was a trading platform that was being migrated from Windows-based to a web-based, so they could continue to compete. And it's got about 5% of the world's trading traffic going through its customers. So it's a very big deal. I wasn't taking it lightly when I went over there to help, but we did lock everyone up for into the conference room for 2 days. Product owners, some directors, developers, testers, you name it. And we went through and created something like this, which is a full understanding of what the trading platform does at each step by example. And you can see the hotspots here by the comments that people are making when they're asking about clarification of something. So you can see the activity and where the questions are popping up that are not answered. You can see the swim lanes where different things are happening. Now they're still learning this, so you can see that they're not adhering to some of the blue and green being in the middle lane, but that was okay. I wasn't going to stop them. They were getting their ideas across and the story was making sense from left to right. They can always clean it up later. Those big red lines show where there's that major change in workflow when there's a problem with acquisition, etc. So event modeling has scaled incredibly well from pet projects and startups all the way through to Fortune 500 companies dealing with incredibly complex multinational information systems, which is great because what we've done here is identified that, yes, this is kind of like an E = MC² realization. We kind of identified the atom of information systems. This is the state transition, and this is the best way I know of how to account for those state transitions. So this is why it's tiny, simple, and should be usable by everyone. Because if I have set of books. Let's say I need everyone to learn agile practices, UML. I need them to understand user story mapping. I need them to understand story sizing. I need them to understand, 5 other things. It's going to take me, maybe domain-driven design. Read the giant book by Eric Evans, and then another one by Vaughn. That's going to take a month to get through that material. And then in order to master all those things, it's going to take a year. And by that point, you're going to be a new set of people, given the turmoil of the industry, how quickly people change jobs. So it's not very sustainable in my eyes to be able to use all of these different techniques. So I need you to be able to talk about the mechanics of something like an event model and explain to someone in 15 minutes. Because mastery, if they apply it immediately, is going to be a day, right? To a level of being proficient. I'm not saying that they're going to be, experts in even the technical tools, but it's going to be an order of magnitude difference between that and the traditional approach of what we need to learn in terms of software building. So, I always use the example that if you give that to, if you mandate a new way of working at your workplace, half the people are just not going to have time. And then half, they're going to say, yeah, I'm going to do it, but they don't actually do it. And then half of that half, they said they did it, but they didn't actually do it. And then the remaining half of that half, they actually read it, but they didn't care. They just read it because he told them to, and they didn't want to get fired. And the remaining half of that half is actually people that did read it and understood it. And then even half of those people are the only ones that are capable of teaching it to others. So by the time you're done with a really onerous set of things for people to learn, you have, 1 to 2% success rate of it actually sticking. And that's why you always have the people that are the hero programmers and all that. That's horrible. That's not a reflection of how evil developers are, how lazy people are these days or something. It's an indication of a system that you have put in place that's not actually built well. So you can't blame others on it. So that's why event modeling needed to be something that could be approachable by everyone, especially me coming in as an outsider to a lot of companies. I couldn't go in and say, well, just read this domain-driven design book. It's just not going to fly. I needed something to be effective immediately, and I needed that to carry the project. And in so doing, I found that it's actually better than all the others for the fact that it does communicate what those other tools do, and just as effectively, if not more. So I do see this as continuing to build momentum in the industry and continue. It's already being used in a lot of places, like large banks. Capital One, I think, is using it. A whole bunch. A bunch of other banks are using it. I know mining companies are using it. Insurance companies already went on about. So it's and a ton of startups we've dealt with. So there's a ton of startups that we've helped that are using this to basically get their roadmaps realized as to what the actual software, the actual system is going to be like at the end of the year. At least give them a goal to work towards. They can always change this as they go. And here's the trade-off. So this is really a greater statement about design. Without design, you have these reworks. If you build a house without a blueprint, some people are going to realize, oh, I didn't know we're going to have a second floor on this house, so I better tear down those walls and build in supporting walls instead. So that's where, on the left diagram here, you can see that certain features that are marked in red as you continue on are the rework of the original implementation where you did them initially. And this is where it's always excused as cyclomatic complexity, et cetera, but it's really a lack of design that's prevalent in the industry. So if you do have the designs, it won't matter when you develop something. Those blocks, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, are interchangeable. I can do them in any order and expect the same effort from that. We call this slices. That event modeling diagram is divided into slices, and we actually have a way of working on fixed costs, because it's really like a shopping list from a grocery store at this point when you're working in this way, that someone did 5 features. This is what they get paid, and those are guaranteed to work. So there's also the right carrots and sticks. People don't get to work on more things if their previous slices aren't working. They have to fix them. And so if someone tries to rip us off and go too fast, they're going to be sitting there fixing their bugs for the next month. And then only then can they move on to new features. So it's a really good way to incentivize proper disciplines. And so we've seen a constant level of quality throughout projects. We don't have that half badly drawn horse that we're accustomed to, which I should probably include on this slide, which is kind of a funny meme. As you draw the horse really well, you start to run out of time, and then you have a really cryptic sketch at the end that looks like a child drew it as the project ends. So we don't have that because the quality is always kept constant through the act of working off the design. And so we have to reevaluate a lot of things. How do we do test-driven development? So test-driven development has now got a defined scope. Test-driven development never had a defined scope for how much you refactor. When you're doing test-driven development, everything's up for grabs. If you find an opportunity to refactor some of the infrastructure while you're doing some functionality, sure, go for it, and pull the rug out from everyone else in your trunk-based development style. So TDD gets adjusted for the better because we actually now limit the refactoring step to just being that one slice, that one state change that you're focusing on. So it really gives a better way to do test-driven development, where you can do test first for how you make a command handler or an event handler or a set of event handlers perform, and how they're implemented. The entire thing about Agile, the idea that you have work in progress limits and all that, that's been redefined entirely, because we're now working with designs. And Agile has always given lip service to design. It said, it's always process over people over process, and these kind of general initial statements that were made set up the industry for being irresponsible. They said you always should have just enough design, but they just left it. There was no guidance whatsoever what just enough design is. It was entirely subjective. It could be taken advantage over by anyone. So we've given the proper level of design, which is why I won't call this anything like Agile, because I think the spirit of this is different. I think we have an ability to say that we have a level of understanding of what acceptable design is. And Agile was just a set of beliefs that were still subject to a lot of interpretation. Extreme programming, likewise, we talked about test-driven development there. Some of the things such as requiring stand-up meetings. I recently wrote a controversial thing on LinkedIn that's picked up quite a bit of readership about how you shouldn't need stand-up meetings. If you have stand-ups in a day, that means that you have regular blockers. And if you have regular blockers, that means you have something fundamentally broken about how you're building things. Other engineering practices don't have daily stand-ups. If you want software engineering, quote unquote, to be actually engineering, then you should be able to work in the way other engineering industries work. And we don't have that. UML is an extreme. It's a great work by Grady, but it focuses on the technical too far low. I think a good chat with Grady Booch and Fred Brooks would be something I'd like to hear, simply because Fred Brooks was able to say that I just need state, and Grady Booch said that I need to understand how each class works. So that's over specification. That's what I talked about at the very beginning there. Too many specifications makes it too rigid, too onerous on both the specifier and the person using the specifications. So that's why UML has tremendously failed, I think. I don't see it being used in my daily work anywhere. And we deal with a ton of companies. So I'm not just talking about my limited experience within one company. I'm talking about multiple companies that I come across. It's just not used. The interpretation of waterfall. So someone say that this is like all design up front and then, implement and test and then deploy or whatever. It's not. Waterfall itself is actually iterative, and so is this. Waterfall has been painted as big design up front for multiple years. Waterfall, as is specified, is an iterative process where you refine things. They're done in what looks like sprints as well. What happened to Waterfall is that I had this conversation with Mel Conway, who was around in those days implementing systems, and basically there was a distrust of the vendors for implementing things by by clients in the 80s and 90s, probably even 70s. And so how they decided to solve that has nothing to do with waterfall. They decided to have the implementation be one company, but because they didn't trust that company to design the system, because they would design it nice and big for themselves, so they'd have a large budget and kind of rip them off. They would give the design to another company so that they would design the system for the original company to implement. So by removing design and implementation to two separate companies, they thought that they would basically have a system that would keep the budgets honest. And like any system, it can be gamed. So how that got gamed is that, well, we're going to give you a very simple design, but in order to make it simple, we're going to take a year to do it. So they stretched out the budget to be quite long because they wanted to have still a greater budget for the design phase, and leave the least amount of budget for the implementation phase, which was going to be another company that they had no interest in helping. So you can imagine that how that ended up being a bad way of keeping scope in check. But it also gave a really bad name to waterfall, which was used during those days. And it's become the scapegoat, the FUD that Agile proponents kept using. And I'm not really here to criticize Agile, but I have been in the Agile circles since the very beginning, since the XP days, and was one of the biggest proponents in Vancouver and around the community, the XP community, for a long, long time. I've come out the other end to realize the huge deficiencies and the oversights in what Agile people were overlooking because it was easier to. And so I'm here basically to correct all the things that went wrong in the last 20 years with people that were following this mindset when building software. So traditional systems, you can expand them. There's actually an updated article on event modeling by Sebastian that has a shorter version of this. So he doesn't use tables, but when we look at a traditional system, we can basically do event modeling for it. These orange stickies don't actually get stored anywhere in the system, but you have a table that allows to show how different data gets changed across time, and along with the UI that's being used at the top. Sometimes we have gears in the UI. That's usually when you kind of expect a little delay from one screen to the next because there's some back-end process. So any kind of back-end process automation, we always have gears there to show that it's really just a robot doing something that a human could. Essentially, that's kind of like that's the basis of the whole approach, is that when we look at systems, we kind of think about how would humans do this without computers. And we can stick robots in there. We can think of forms that people submit as actual, physical forms with carbon copies behind them going to different departments on a little cart. It's helpful to think of information systems that way still, because it immediately demystifies the technical and it puts you back focused on what is the state of the system, what information is where at what time. And that's really going to take you a lot further than getting stuck in the minutia of some algorithm that only a developer can do. For those that understand domain-driven design, we kind of take aggregates and split them up, think of them as streams and substreams of data. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we can get into that in the questions and answers and some of the other things I can show. But anyway, it's about whittling down just to the events that you're interested in. You can see a composition of functions. We can see, don't worry if you can't read this, you'll have access to a Miro board that has this diagram on it. But concepts, large concepts like a little, I guess a graph of objects, if you're into object-oriented programming, can always be deciphered into, or not deciphered, but decomposed into smaller subsets of that graph for different pieces of functionality. And that's where looking at subsets of events and filtering them gives you the same effect, but better. And also why some things like aggregates are actually not that great from domain-driven design in my perspective. As an example, If you're to cancel an order, do you really need to know of the fact that the address was changed somewhere in its history and things like that, or what the address is? So you don't really need to follow this aggregate pattern to grab the whole thing, because you might want to look at it. You really don't need to. You just need to know that the order of this ID is canceled, in fact, and you don't need to do that. And so when you start to look at each individual operation on a graph that represents the concept of an object, such as an order, you start to look at the fact that this is actually decomposable, and you can look at it more mathematically without scaring anyone, but you can look at subsets of those pieces and still make sense of them. It doesn't mean that you have an opportunity to miss something. That's only if you're just a developer and you might want to have a class to see everything in there. But if you're working with an event model, you see what's involved and you don't have to rely on just the code. So yeah, SLAs. So when I put in other concepts on here, I can say that something happens within 2 seconds, and then I can put down some invariance if I want, if it's really important, such as no more than 8 hours in a day. There's a time tracking application, so you can't log more than 8 hours in a day. Polyglot architecture. So there's another one that's really been enabled by looking at any workflow that we do as a set of state transitions, and they're clearly defined. There's a contract for what you expect before, and there's a contract of what you're leaving behind when you're done your piece of work. That can be done in entirely different tech stacks. So it allows you to hire people from different tech stacks and still make the whole workflow work quite well. I mean, we already have the beginnings of this with the push to serverless, where you can write a function in whatever language you want. But that doesn't mean that stops, that you need serverless to do that. In fact, I push a lot of the projects to actually be multi-language and multi-framework supported, because that really does expand the amount of people that can work on things. And because we're working on these small set of state changes, we don't have a lot of need for some person to look at someone else's code to change it. We throw out that code if there's some problem, because it's easier to just re-implement what we see on the event model and put that into play and test the system again. So there's a lot of ability for, something was written in Golang and has to be rewritten in .NET. That's okay. Those Lego blocks are small now, so we can do that, and that's what enables you to be to support multiple languages for the same application. And of course, I kind of already touched on this. Everyone can use it. So designers use the top swim lanes. The architects use mostly the bottom swim lanes that show which systems have what information. Developers look at these vertical slices. They say, for example, I might want to look at that cleaning schedule screen, implement that. I know that I'm going to, that this is going to work when the rest of the project is done, because I have that contract with what data is in there, the shape of the data, and the scenarios in which that can be received. So it's really about making that Lego click kind of cadence to everything. So developers love that. They in our company, they get paid the same amount for each one. And they guarantee that always works. If there's a problem, they have to go fix it. All they ever charge for are these slices. And so we can do incredibly accurate estimates. When we have an event model, we can tell exactly how much it's going to cost, and we can work with clients if they need to add more scope later. We can see why. It's not just an arbitrary decision by one of their employees throwing in, hey, just add another field to this form because I forgot. That's done very publicly now, and you understand that there is an increase in budget. So when everyone is looking at the solution, it's not like they're going to blame someone, but they understand that they're trying to help the entire thing be as well put together as possible. So it's really hard for people to mess with an event model because it's so collaborative that, you either know you have good people on your team or you don't very quickly. Project managers use the, velocity of how many slices are getting done. They can take certain, parts to be implemented first. So you can kind of look at this and mark up an area. everyone work on this area first. So you don't need to burn down like a Kanban board. You just kind of circle the area of the event model that you want to work on next. And so that throws away all of the ticketing systems that you need for planning. You can still have a ticketing system, of course, for end users submitting bugs. That's fine. You can in fact stick those as notes in here with a link to the ticket. But generally, we just translate whatever's wrong into a note directly on here and fix it by adjusting the slice to do what it's supposed to or make other changes. So it becomes really like marking up a blueprint at that construction site and saying the pipes are now a little bit wider, you need to drill these holes a little bit bigger for them to go through the walls, those kinds of things. You get that kind of mentality. And of course QA uses this to really look at the overall user experience and to see where there's opportunities to have more exploratory testing rather than just automating, right? I mean, it really depends where your QA department is. I think a lot of companies are still stuck as the QA folks are the ones that are just writing scripts and scripting the manual process. With this, you can start to give them more control of understanding, the overall application and start to put together more exploratory testing, which is the kind of next stage you want in your QA anyway. So the book is coming, as I said. I'm glad that I waited because COVID did change a lot of things, and we did learn a lot of new lessons on that. And then, of course, we have our own meetup that's on Fridays usually. Kind of missed it last Friday because of this meetup, and I think it kind of slows down during the summer anyway. But I try to have it at least once every 2 weeks during the summer, and then back to every week. We have our own Slack channel that we go over all of these concepts in detail and post links and help each other out. So it's a fairly big community now, about 1,200 people on there. I'm not sure how many are active at any one time, but generally most questions get answered these days within a couple of hours. And of course, I have a whole bunch of these types of recordings on the subject on YouTube. So if you search for event modeling on YouTube, you will certainly find the recordings that I put together over the last couple of years. Yeah, so that's that. And maybe some questions right now that people have, I can answer. So I see some chat coming in. Let's see here. What do we have? Yeah, so Carl, I'm not gonna, I wasn't, so something about the waterfall. I'll defer to Mel Conway, who has the best experience with that. And you can probably ask him about where he had his information from on Twitter. He's quite active still, Conway's Law. Yes. So he'd probably be happy to answer that. But anyway, the point is, I think Waterfall got kind of thrown under the bus with Agile. I don't think it was fairly represented. Yeah.
If I can comment, I think one of the big problems with a lot of the bureaucracy that's been put in place is a lack of trust. And what I see with event modeling is a very quick way to build trust, because you have this incredible transparency and visibility that people can comprehend. Because I've always come across people who develop this. I think you used a term earlier to describe this cliquish language. In other words, it's a language that's unless you are part of that clique, you don't understand the language. And they revel in this, building this clique in their own little world, where in fact they should be going out of their way to use plain language to communicate so that their customer can understand. And so for me, it's always been about trying to find a way to make transparent what I do. So one of the reasons why I use Kanban is because I share that board with my customer and they can see what's going on. And it's a way for them to see what's happening. Now, if that board is now connected to the story, that because I mean, yes, we think in stories, and we the two things that humans do well is we remember a route from one place to another, and we can remember a story. So if you combine these two things, because if you look at that, it's a route through this map, and the question is, yes, if you want to go there, then you follow this route. So it just sticks in the mind, and it seems like it's going to be incredibly powerful. Because other thing for me was that you mentioned these other engineering disciplines. So you can go on a building site and you can give people a plan, and they will create something that looks like that because they understand their piece of it. But with software, it's invariably difficult because we've had mechanisms that by the time you've completed the picture, you could have well have written the code. That's the problem with UML, is that it goes so far down that road.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you get all the way through to sequence diagrams and the branching within sequence diagrams, and then you have to cross-reference them over to activity diagrams and then overlay that with your component diagrams. I mean, yeah, that's a lot of work, and it's work that doesn't speak to everyone. There's a lot of technical things on there that are just not going to be, you're not going to have the interest of someone from management or someone from UI design, etc. So the alienation is really something we should be, the silos, the cliques, esoteric language where it's not needed, right? It has to be stamped out as soon as possible, in my opinion. A lot of these regular, they have yet another to-do app that someone is writing. They have good, it's a very simple concept, yet everything is painted as technical, and no one can talk about it unless they're specifically talking about user experience. It's not a very healthy way to work, I don't think. The more that people can get involved at all levels, just even if they're not contributing, at least the fact that everyone does understand what's going on, and nothing's coming out of left field as to like why a problem's there or why something has to get redesigned. They're like, oh yeah, that thing we talked about, it didn't work out so well. I got it. I see how much time you put into that and how complex it was. It's that transparency that, then again, going back to your original point, trust. That then you trust your teammates for the work that they said that they say they're doing.
Yes, one thing that I've had an experience the last 18 months is to work with somebody who's never been on the producing side of producing requirements or being in a position to explain what a software system should do. So it's given me a new perspective on the limitations that people have, whereas these were all incredibly intelligent people who are experts in other fields, but their ability to describe what a software system should do is limited, or even to understand what it's capable of.
Yeah.
And yet I can now see how event modeling would speak to that. So it just seems incredibly powerful. Are there any? I don't want to hog the thing here. Are there any questions? So we've got what type of pushbacks do you generally get when introducing the concept, and how do you navigate that pushback?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think anyone can, if you've read something and you want to introduce it to your company, everyone will understand that you're introducing something new. And I forget who it was that talked about this, but they gave a really good analogy to what happens. And it doesn't matter if it's event modeling. This is actually something that happens to any new concept you try to introduce. When you're trying to change the way people work for the better, but no one sees, what you're trying to do, or they have doubts, or they tried it themselves and failed and they don't want to do it. there is this inertia in a company, and it doesn't matter what you're trying to do. And so as a consultant, and you're the only one coming in to try and help, and you're supposed to introduce something, usually the level of burden is quite high already. But there's others that will put that on top, because they'll say, well, you're changing my work, and I'm actually quite upset that you're here. I want to continue working the way I did. So the way I heard it framed, and I forget who said this, it's quite good. It's like antibodies, and you're the virus coming into a cell. So all of a sudden you have these antibodies, that are coming into, well, not in the cell, but in your body. You have these antibodies coming in. There's an invader in the organism. You're the virus. And so the natural defense to anything is to keep things the same. And so you're going to have the antibodies come out and try and destroy you, just because things. So that's why a lot of times these the companies that are the most successful with things like event modeling and really changing the way they're working is top down. Unfortunately, there's been very limited success with the grassroots kind of at the implementation level. Some developer finding out about this and then moving that. The best thing for that developer to do is really to get the CEO, if it's a small enough company, or as high up as they can in terms of their connections within the organization, and get them to study and understand, and then spearhead from the top down to change the organization. That's why strong leadership is always necessary. It doesn't matter if it's this or anything else. If you don't have strong leadership, a strong technical, a strong business vision, those strong technical and business visions are what's going to make or break your company. Maybe you have a lot of autonomy, and it really doesn't matter how you build things. So there's been success with people using this for developing a service or a part of their website, where they are given the autonomy, and the rest of the company doesn't care how they do it, as long as that part comes out and that they can support it, and the operational complexity to maintain it is not something that they can't handle. That's okay too. But I think that's a missed opportunity. I think this way of working is quite good overall, in terms of having a very clean way of representing what everything is doing in the whole organization, because you can actually add manual process to this. Like there's no reason that you can't put a form in there, or someone received this email and then therefore they go and do X. So it's actually more about business process management, but it has that nice overlay right into information and how technical that can be implemented, specifically how clean it is for things like event sourcing, which is really hard to get into. So one of the interesting things about this, if anyone's been trying to adopt event sourcing or CQRS or domain-driven design, you're going to have a hell of a time representing that from the technical perspective, or trying to get your boss to read the domain-driven design book. Do not even mention any of those words. Just do event modeling, and you will attain the same goals without breaking your head on that brick wall. Just use the door. The event modeling is like the door that just allows you to introduce any number of these, the hexagonal architecture, any number of frameworks that allow you to talk about dependency injection or other things that you want to introduce that help your projects and your systems. With event modeling, it's a way to not bash someone over the head with these complicated concepts. You're going to get nowhere. It's very hard for people, especially from different sides and different teams, to absorb them. So you need a common denominator, plain English, and just example of how the system works to get that across. And that's been the biggest advantage of event modeling, because that's, like I said at the beginning when we were chatting, that was the biggest problem, is that I needed to work with, at the very beginning when I started, work with whatever projects I got. And I didn't have time. And I love domain-driven design and event sourcing and all that, but there's no way that I was going to be selling this to clients that have like, what are you doing? Why don't you do what everyone else is doing? So I needed to have a way to show that the system will show these screens in this order and you'll capture this information. Deal? Okay, good. How much will it cost? This much. Okay, good. Go do it. Now I could do event sourcing and everything else. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. So these things happen in this timeline. Yeah, that's what happens. And oh, so we have that information in the system. Yes, we do. I did all that without talking about event sourcing. And they're like, oh, that's really good. The other system that they put together, the other team did last year, they didn't have it. No, they didn't. They only had these snapshots of what the system was at that point. You would probably have to, do a restore of the database and maybe fiddle with source control to see what happened. Oh, that sounds horrible. But you have this information. Yeah, I do. I didn't mention event sourcing. So this is the way that you show exactly what happens.
So,
or if you have to, yeah.
Does this understand the concept of an audit trail?
Yeah.
And so on that, I have a question, which is probably an event sourcing question. Is now you've built something. So where I'm coming from is I just did a system where we actually embedded a BPM. Because that's how they initially modeled it. And we have custom forms on top that provide the user interaction. So the user has a fairly natural interaction, but they now are able to introduce things like, well, we want a extra step in here that does authorization of these things that need to happen. Now, event sourcing says you can replay all these events to get to a certain point, but that's assuming that you have the same set of events. But now we're introducing a new event. How does that? How do you deal with that in the event sourcing world when they say we want this new event to take place?
Yeah. So there's two things you touched on. If it's a different version of a same event because it has extra information, that's just event versioning. And Greg Young has a book on event versioning. But simply they get mapped. So there's these called upcasters or something like that you basically transform V1 to V2. So whenever you're looking at a history of events, you're always looking at the latest version of the event, and you can ignore the previous ones because you translate them. Let's say you added the date of birth to the form for registration. And, as of, last month, we've been collecting date of birth for new registration. So what happens to everyone that registered up to that point over last year and such? Well, when we're looking at those events and they're the version 1 of that event, and version 2 is now the one that has date of birth. When we're replaying events and we get a V1, a version 1 event, we transcribe it to V2 and insert maybe a null or maybe something that makes them 5 years old, just in case, as a default value, so that we continue to work with data that we're modeling right now. So event versioning is quite famous for that, but it actually should raise business questions like, yeah, maybe we started selling a wider variety of books that now you need to check the age of the person that's purchasing them. So by default, maybe you have to show, or maybe you have to email existing customers to say, please provide your date of birth. And therefore you can add another event, maybe re-register them with the date of birth, or maybe have another type of event called date of birth specified. Depends on what you want to do. But again, it's not a technical question. It's really what you want to do with the information and how you want your system to react. So pushing it on to developers, hey, now we have, need to track date of birth. Well, yeah, how? You tell me, it's your business. So we all together need to know how we treat that new information in the system. And we can show that on an event model. We can show the original events happening and then things being looked at in the catalog of books. And then we can show what happens when we have the introduction of this new event with the date of birth in there, and maybe some books added to inventory that have a minimum age limit or something like that. And then we can show by example what people should see. when in either scenario, you're someone that's new, that's come in, you actually specify your date of birth and you're underage, so you don't see these books. If you're of the age or higher, then you do see them. Here's what happens when you're a user that's already existed. Do you get a prompt? Do you have a batch job that'll go one Friday before you release this feature that's going to prompt people to go and click and update their date of birth? It's really for the business to decide what to do, but you can show that as a storyboard of all of those scenarios happening. And it's quite easy to just copy existing parts of the event model to show those new scenarios at the very beginning if it's to do with registration. And then everyone should understand that, as a developer, I should know exactly what to do if someone's elaborated what happens in that user experience, what information gets captured at what point through what form of communication.
So once again, the visibility of everything allows you to reason about it in a way that the business can participate and
that's right,
and understand. And then ideally, if you have tools that actually allow you to show version changes of the
that's right,
event model, then obviously you have another powerful mechanism, because you can go back and look at what the event model was.
exactly.
So I can imagine that the need for tools that do that kind of thing, and maybe in very complex cases allow you to zoom in on detail and go back out. Because
Exactly.
a lot of these models can get very busy, and you need to focus on an area at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But still, everybody expects it's easy to find something because it's either that way or it's this way or it's up or it's down. There's a two-dimensional, or you're moving in one plane, whereas a lot of software development is multi-dimensional models and concepts, and the amount of people that can deal with that are small.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why my biggest thing to tackle is to really think back to the very original presentation part of the presentation. This is all about what is easiest for human beings to deal with, and it's always that storyline and understanding things in a linear fashion. And because we've been kind of educated to think about programming and flowcharts, we always want to show that if-then statement. And the minute that you have imagine an event model where you could have two possibilities, either the login was successful or not, and you start to show things in parallel, it's now a lot harder to follow and trace if information was there or not. So you start to lose so many of the advantages of the audit-like way that you can do this. And that large project that was saved, that I was talking about, was really saved by the fact that they could tie in any assumptions to say, do I actually have this information at this time? And if I do, where did it come from? Is that done? Is someone looking at that? So that's what rescued that project. It's called being information complete. And it's really hard to be information complete when you have decision trees in your diagram. It just becomes a math problem, but there's very few people, like you said, that are equipped to do that. But as long as you keep it to a story without branching, then anyone can do an audit and say why something's there, who did it, all sorts of things. Just a lot of information is moved that way. And more importantly, it's actually retained in your head a lot easier because you're looking at a linear stream of events and linear stream of information. So you can definitely always go back. I mean, once you're working with event model, after a couple of months, everyone's really used to the main flow, right? They can take a new person to the company and, point them at exactly what's going on, which part they'll be working on. And you really have no excuse to not contribute code on your first day. That's really kind of like a marquee of a really successful company. If you really got your ducks in a row, you should be able to have a brand new employee contribute something and even deploy something the first day. And I can't imagine how you would do that more successfully than with an event model that tells you, like, you're looking at this screen, you're going to be making this button, and if you do it right, this event gets stored into Event Store. Easy to test for success, and you know that they're limited in terms of like how much things they can break, right? We have those scopes per slice, so it's safer to do experiments. It just starts to open up a lot of possibilities in that respect. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is enlightening. I mean, I could probably go on and on and on. And
I'm just wondering if there's anything else that I could show. I definitely have this. I'm going to share the screen one last time just to show the main Miro board that we use to educate on our meetups. So you can see our time tracking application here, where we kind of go from, how someone would add, what happened last workday and earlier today, how you enter in your time, how that's actually done through an event model, and where the events get, stored. There's a lot of other concepts that we talk about in terms of having integration tests, kind of really not something that's special. So this testing triangle is really absent. We really have more of a testing rectangle where a lot of the integration tests are framed exactly as unit tests would be. So this integration phase is usually one of the biggest problems, and we continue to switch back and forth between that. So we look at how those concepts of noun, verb, data-centric versus verb, noun, behavior-centric issues that arise, how they're pushed into one phase to another, how the coupling starts to move, and what traditional projects end up doing inadvertently, not that they aim to do that, but that's what happens to them, and how we fix that through this. We also look at, just to leave you with some more thoughts about this, how you use an event model to replace Wordly maps. So Wordly maps kind of tell you, how you're moving certain pieces of technology from being custom to being product and then a commodity, and how you move them together. Well, an event model at a very zoomed out level gives you the same thing as you start to adopt a digital currency and all sorts of stuff. You can have a very zoomed out view of an event model to show at the strategic level, at this, for the boardroom where the executives are meeting, about how we're placing our company to be on the right path with all the trends of our competitors and other tools in the industry. So, and then as you zoom in, as these tools like ONote and others that are being developed, we'll be able to zoom in and out of that view into actual implementation. Kind of showed some of this already, but there's, let's say, a really big one is, that footprint, the tech footprint, of what you want to have for your online stuff versus something that's on cold storage, how event sourced makes that easier. Also how retiring your data is really important. I think in event sourcing, that's rarely talked about, is making sure that your entities don't live forever if you either designed them wrong or you don't have a proper data management store. How does that change your models? So we explore how we have non-entity tombstoning or end of lifing or closing the books on those entities. We look at all those. So if you want to get at some of these notes, the link is in our Slack. We look at a lot of different concepts here, so and meet about it. So I hope that everyone has learned something, and that you come to this and learn some more with us at any point. So if there's any other questions, I think that's all I wanted kind of to show. The link to this is in the time tracking channel on the event modeling group, Slack group. So you can get at this and inspect it. There's a lot of neat lessons on here. And that's it.
I'm just going to share this link here for anybody who's wondering where to find event modeling.
Yeah.
If you Google it, then it's
yeah. Eventmodeling.org with one L.
One L. Yes, and then there's a link to the Slack and lots of
that's right.
nice videos, and none of them are incredibly long. Which is nice because you can work through them in short bits.
Yeah,
and
so there's the main site, and if we go to the bottom here, that's the original article is linked at the bottom, and that's where you'll get most of the information that you heard about here with further explanation deep down. And most importantly, if you're going to be doing a workshop, there's 7 steps of how you can do it yourself. Start with the brainstorming, create the plot, the storyboard, start to identify where you have the inputs and where you have the outputs, and organize it according to Conway, who you mentioned a lot, and then of course get the actual scenarios, which we talked about, given when thens for individual pieces. But yeah, that's a great place to start. That article was trending on Hacker News a couple of years ago, made it to the top of the pile, which was nice. So hopefully that gives you a good refresher on what we covered here, and with some applicable stuff.
Okay. Oh, this has been wonderful. So one thing I actually wanted to do right at the start, we have a giveaway of a JetBrains coupon during every meetup.
Yeah, I love their stuff. I always use it.
So what I've started doing is at the end of this meetup, we send out a link to a form, which is basically a feedback form. And at the bottom of that is a section where they say, yes, I want to be part of the draw, and they give their email address and name and Twitter handle. So the previous meetups names are in this list. I found this little app that's got like a wheel. I'm actually going to spin it twice just to show that somebody could have won. Robert, sorry, you're not going to be the one that's winning. It's going to be the next one. So the winner will be...
Robert already has one.
Dav.
Excellent.
He's a regular on our meetup, and I will send him the coupon afterwards. And then next week we do the draw for the people who attended today. So, Adam, thank you very much for enlightening us.
It's my pleasure. I hope it made sense. I try to change the presentation for each time, so hopefully this iteration made sense.
I definitely, well, it did to me. I'm busy working on an article where I'm trying to tease apart this why do we make things complicated when they're already complex, and we should be simplifying them. So when I see something that's absolutely collapsing complexity in a big way, it's fantastic. And then when I dig in and I see that it just sound, that's why I'm so excited, because I can't. It just keeps answering the questions with a few simple rules, and that's what we need.
Took a lot of years to get here. It looks simple, but it took a lot of effort.
You walked a long road, and but you were looking for that way to simplify it. So which is important, because not everybody does. A lot of people just stick with what they know, or they revel in complexity, and they try to impress themselves, and it gets even worse. So thank you for what you've done. Thank you for sharing it with us.
My pleasure. Anytime.
I'm definitely gonna try and join your meetup whenever I can.
Yeah, if you have your own meetup, maybe you have hackathons or whatever, event modeling is a real
Yes.
good way to get those going.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. And
Definitely.
it's a way to, someone said it's a way to compress time. Like we found a way to compress time somehow,
Exactly.
which is a
Exactly.
good thing because we all could use some more of that.
Yeah. If I look back on this last 18 months, the concept of time has gone haywire. So
Yeah.
we all need to get the doctor to come and visit us so that we can stay in his TARDIS for a few days and step back refreshed 2 minutes later.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Adam. This was a wonderful experience. And
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Be safe, be healthy. Some of our audience have been able to vaccinate. Some of them are coming up on the 1st of September. Then they can register and vaccinate.
Yeah, I'm vaccinated. Yay.
Oh, lovely.
100%.
I've had my first jab, which gives away my age. In South Africa now, people who are 35 and over can register and vaccinate at the moment.
You guys are much later than Canada.
Yes,
that's weird.
No, we've had a terrible time of it, and from the 1st of September, the 18 to 34-year-olds can do it.
That's great.
So stay healthy, and
yeah, I hope it warms up for you.
We all hope so too. I haven't got much hope for the next month because usually the early part of August is can be pretty cold.
Mm-hmm.
In 1981, the 13th of September, it snowed in Johannesburg. So
wow.
But
it's no longer snowing in Vancouver in winters, so we're going to be looking at that the same way. So
yes. So thank you, everybody, and have a nice evening. And once again, thanks, Adam.
Thank you so much. And get a hold of me if you need any extra questions answered.
Oh,